if you haven't figured it out already, so Derrick and I, this is going to be much less of a presenter. We're just going to talk through each other, talk over each other and through each other, and not about each other. but we are both super excited. I was excited. I submitted a topic. He submitted a very similar topic. We both got co-presenter status, and as we were talking about it, I just realized I think we're both very passionate about this. I'm a big believer in LabVIEW code. There's so many ways to do it, and unlike text programming, there's visual aspect, which adds this whole other dimension. And it makes it very important to find a style that works for you and your organization. I kind of like if you ask those same questions that you did initially, now that we've got more people.
Okay, so now that there's like 3 times as many people, let's just have on the table. So how many people here understand the difference between by value and by reference? Awesome. How many people here use reference frameworks or do implementations using DVRs and references? And how many people use active framework? Okay. We're going to be obviously focusing on why, we're going to be mentioning why we don't use active framework and the flexibilities that affords us. And the first demo will be taking a look at some LabVIEW class hierarchies to demonstrate one of the big reasons.
Good. We'll go ahead and get started. Also, the slides will, of course, you can download them from NI. I believe Derrick also has a web page he'll be showing that where you could get them as well. So if this is an introduction to references and we move fast, just go with the flow, and you can come talk to us at the end or look in detail at the slides when we get through, because I am going to move pretty quickly through this first one. I think based on the audience, we want to jump into the demos as soon as possible so you can see some of the tools that are available, some of the styles. First, a little bit about us. I started programming LabVIEW in 2000. I'm married with 5 kids, and I can tell this about myself over and over and over again, but yeah, my kids always make fun of me. Okay, I'm going to tell a joke that's horrible. I was in the car with my 16-year-old daughter and her friend, and I told some stupid joke, and my daughter just immediately says, "Just laugh, otherwise they'll tell the same joke again." That's me.
So I'm Derrick Bommarito. I've got my BS in computer science back in 12, and I've been doing LabVIEW ever since. I am not married. I do have 2 fur babies. And after staring at LabVIEW for weeks on end, I need to unwind by falling out of airplanes for fun. There's no such thing as a perfectly good airplane.
I'm not sure how much this outline applies. Basically, we're going to fly through some slides and then do a bunch of demos. And I think we're going to skip this. I think everybody else, or everybody expressed some understanding of by reference, by value. To me, DAC MX feels like it's by value. So many other things that I like just feel, or sorry, by reference. I mean, so many things I like feel like by reference. I like having Derrick explain this slide.
So in Core 1, Core 2, you learn some design patterns to enable you to have different things running in different loops and how to get data between them. But they require a lot of glue logic to get those to communicate to each other. So that's not something that scales very well. If you need to add a second camera, you now just have twice as many queues that you're needing to send around for your state machines and any control or parameters that you're operating with. So it's you having to make those second queues and stuff if you're just using the patterns that NI teaches you about. And so another technique in just normal LabVIEW is functional globals, but then you're restricted to singletons. And if you want to have more than one of something, you now have to have identifiers, and you're looking through sets of data and parameters to run your code. We just don't like doing any of that.
So Actor Framework. Actor Framework is funny. I feel like there's a steep learning curve. And then as you learn it, you can do stuff with it, but I don't know. It felt like when I started using reference-based LabVIEW objects a while back, and I really liked it. I felt like it was a good trade-off. Whereas everything is a message in Actor Framework. With the reference, you can put a queue inside the reference, or inside your object, and you can have an in queue, so you can still do messaging. You can also have a DVR that wraps data where you can immediately say, if I call this method on this by reference object, that method, unlike a send message or an in queue, will wait until it has access, until it actually changes the data, and then it'll come back to the caller and return execution. And sometimes that synchronous control makes the code so much easier, because instead of just sending a message and saying, well, I've sent the message, I don't know when it's going to actually execute, you can actually know this VI will not complete until things are done.
But you can do the same in Actor Framework, you just need to use blocking code.
Right, but now it's instantiating another queue to send the thing back, and
That's built in, you just change your inheritance to the reply message.
so this will be our first demo. These are.
And actually, since they asked, let's show the actor. Oh. Okay, we might. Oh, this is good. You solved that way fast. So what he's doing is pulling up two examples. They attempt to do the same thing, one with Actor Framework and one with the by reference class. And how many of you used PID before? Okay, excellent. I tried to think of something that was the most obvious thing, and I picked PID. And it's kind of a hokey algorithm, but I put something in there to try to simulate room temperature and say, yeah, we're controlling room temperature. So the idea is, both of these are control systems. If I tried to do them as simple as possible so that we could look at each one, could that give us some sort of trade-off between messaging and references and tell us anything? And I don't know, so we won't spend a lot of time at this, but this would be the first introduction to by reference stuff and some of the things you can do with it.
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at the block diagrams for these, so the by reference implementation is on the left, Active Framework is on the right. There's very similar structures. But the big takeaway here is if we look at the class hierarchy, here's the one VI for our by reference implementation. Everything else in this tree was brought in because we're using Active Framework. So in every way you have to interact with an actor is by creating a message class. Your projects get very large very quick.
Point out, could you get that? It's Chris, right? Chris pointed out the wait on response, and that is a good point. You can get that synchronous behavior from actors. I'll be the first to admit I'm not great on Active Framework, but I assume is that Chris kind of how Active Framework got it. This is the UI loop of the Active Framework side. So what I ended up doing, I don't know if this is what I thought of, is you send a message that's a message to say, send me back the current set point, your current process variable, and your current output. It then sends that to the other loop, gets it back, sends it back in a variant, and then you can display it on the chart. And we send that message 10 times a second. That's one way of doing that in Actor. But you can compare that to the by reference method, which is those three things were in a DVR, so we're just pulling them out. And I really like the property codes. I feel like if you have a class and you want to know something about it, it's almost like the fastest way if that class has accessors wired up to a property node, you immediately see, oh look, I can read the output process variable at set. So it's a simple example. I mean, we have the reference wire here, so that the event loop can change, for example, your set point. You can send a message to say, hey, change the set point. So the interesting thing is set point you can write to, process variable and output you can't. And I guess one other thing I'll emphasize about this example is by reference classes have references in them. This also has the added ability that it has started an asynchronous loop in the background. So like it or hate it, this is not your PID loop. You might miss some points, or you might get some points twice, depending on how fast this loop is running compared to your PID loop. The PID loop is running somewhere else. I made a decision for this one to say you can only have one of these at a time, so the PID loop is non-reentrant. So at any time, if you want to see that PID loop, You can double click on it in the project, it opens up, you can turn on execution or retain wire values, see what's happening, and it makes it easy to debug that way. Once, if you do want multiple ones at a time, change a few things and you get multiple of these at a time in this next view.
Okay, so we're going to actually talk about what our implementation looks like. I'm going to try and switch the monitor stuff around.
Is there any questions or comments about this?
That VI on the left, is that an initialization VI?
Yes, that's a good point. So since we'll cover more later, but yes, before you use a by reference, you have to initialize it.
Okay, there we go. So this is a little bit messy, got a couple of extra lines overlaying everything, but this is the basic structure for all of how I implement by reference classes. So in your class data, which you can see here in this upper type definition, the only thing that we have in the class data is a reference. Another thing you can do is anything else that's a reference you can put there, or anything that's going to be remain constant throughout the lifetime of that instance. You don't need to hide in the reference, so you don't have to block for accessing it. And then we've got an actual ref data type definition. This is what gets put into the DVR. And so we just always have that as a private type in the class. And then you'll have a constructor and a cleanup function because you have to actually call the nodes to create those. So in our constructor method, at a minimum, you're just taking your ref data and turning it into a reference and putting that in the class. Once that's available and on the class wire, you can branch that class wire as much as you want, have access to that DVR everywhere. As you develop larger and larger systems, you will probably be doing more initialization and other stuff in your constructor.
So the point is you get that reference to the same data there on the
Correct. You're getting a copy of the memory address of where that data lives instead of a copy of the data. And then, like all good LabVIEW programmers, I know you all are, we have to clean up after ourselves. And if we don't tell LabVIEW that we're done with a DVR, it will end up causing problems and memory leaks and all sorts of stuff. So at the very minimum, you just have to delete the DVR. For basic usage, LabVIEW will clean everything else up itself. Sometimes what order you close things down in matter. So you can see in the second example, we're using the error wire to order that. And then sometimes things can start getting really crazy when you have TCP stream communication and a messaging layer, and there's a whole bunch of handshaking and references that need to get cleaned up. Using the reference, so this is primarily done with the in-place element structure with a dereference node on it. Pull out what you need from it. Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did you just use corporate data for that?
So if you have an accessor created for it, you could use that instead. I'm not sure. Is there a different way to use DVRs?
No, and I think a convention I like to use, a lot of this is style, so we'll be talking about some style. But one way to do it is say, I'm going to use an accessor that's public for any data that anybody can see. And you're right, you could totally put it in an accessor. This might be some data that you don't want public, in which case you haven't created a public accessor for it, so it's easy to dereference it using the in-place structure.
So,
Yeah, I think an important point here is that the DVRs, as you mentioned, they log. And so if you are going to unbundle, do something unbundled, that you may want that whole block to be inside of the input.
yeah, we'll be talking about that. We've got a couple of examples demonstrating that. So yeah, there's different ways to do it. With me, I do have a lot more in-place element structures on my block diagram because I have some tricks that make it really easy to get those into my code quickly. So that saves me from having to write an accessor. I skip it. But yeah, you can wrap it in an accessor. If it's set up as a property in the project, you can use a property node for that.
Great. I think I've already mentioned I like accessors as an example of popping up and seeing them. As you do these, this is nothing specific with by reference classes, but in classes in general, you might want to talk about virtual folders. If you can define a consistent organizational scheme for your methods and your data across your organization, it makes reading it much easier. So here I've thrown up one, not saying this is the only way, but we keep private stuff in a private folder, accessors and accessors, methods in here, and the class only has two things, creation and deletion. Everything else goes in methods. One way of doing it. And the last one, something that I've found that I like is when it's a by reference wire, go to the class properties, make the wire 1 pixel wide. Makes it immediately obvious looking that, oh yeah, that class is by value because it's multiple pixels, that one's by reference.
We recommend to reflect the same folder structure on this, so great physical folder, but also keep corresponding stuff and physically folders.
That's an excellent question. Anybody?
My personal preference is not to.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question was, do you recommend doing on disk the same folder structure as you do in the project? I'm seeing some people shake their heads. I move things around enough on here, it's really hard and out of sync. I know some people do it, so kind of a personal preference. Anybody want to argue for doing it?
Source cost control that you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for my classes, I will have a flat folder structure. As I'm changing scope and refactoring, I don't have to worry about mirroring that on disk. So it just saves me a step. My project organizes the code for me. I don't see the need to keep it organized on disk as much.
Oh.
There we go. Okay, so as was mentioned earlier, anytime you're in that in-place element structure and you have a DVR dereferenced, that DVR becomes locked. Nobody else can get access into that from that point on, with the exception of if there multiple people can access it simultaneously if they're only reading out of it. So you can have a little bit of control over sharing access to that data and stopping different processes from stepping on each other if they're primarily just reading data out of it. Alternatively, so a lot of times for me, I'm pulling stuff out of the DVR because I just need to get a copy of that data and then I'm doing something with that in another part of the application. Sometimes you need to do something with the data that's in the reference and put it back into the reference before anybody else accesses it to prevent race conditions and just getting a solid atomic operation. So in the lower snippet, you can see you can do more inside the in-place element structure as well. To prevent deadlocking, one of the things you want to avoid as much as possible is, so I'm always just passing my class wires straight past my in-place element structure node. If you pass that into other calls inside your in-place element structure, it's really easy to accidentally try and access that reference again. And at that point, you've just deadlocked your application. Since the DVR is what's causing, it does have access control built into it, that opens you up to start using more reentrant clones of your sub-VIs for, you can more purposely decide at what level of the code do things wait for each other. Moving to shared clones does make things much harder to debug. So usually while I'm developing a class, everything is initially non-reentrant, so I can just get into stuff in the project. It'll be the one that's running, make sure it all works that way, and then for things like network communications, where we're going to have multiple client connections, then I move everything to shared clones, so my different connected clients don't influence each other's message handling. Another thing that's really easy to do, and this is one of the things that Active Framework is meant to do out of the box, is launching asynchronous VIs in the background. You can use your call by reference node that we can see here in the upper one, where you can just, all we have to do is pass the class into it in the call by reference node, and we still have access to all of that same information. Great power comes great responsibility. You want to try to, you gotta be careful with how many things you're spawning in the background, because if you lose track of your asynchronous children, they will run amok.
Just this is me on a soapbox. Anybody see the C0 there going into the OpenVI reference? One thing that I found helpful, and you're going to talk about the PlaceVI contents later on, in our development system, we've created a ring that maps a name to many of the commonly used values. I think that makes it a lot more readable because instead of looking up there and saying C0, you look up there and say reentrant, wait until complete, or wait, call and forget, or whatever it is. Just a suggestion to make it more readable.
So now we're going to look at a demo where I purposely caused things to break. I'm going to try and get my monitor swapped back around here. Yay, okay. Thank you, PowerPoint, for strong-arming my displays.
Just that. I am kind of curious. One part of this presentation that I think we removed the slide for. Does anybody use the GDS LVOOP development system? Excellent. Okay, so there are some hands. That will allow you to create not only classes, but you can put references in those classes. So we looked a little bit into that. That is out there. It can help you create accessor VIs easily, create classes with icons. Yeah, it's not, you don't hear a lot about it, so I don't know how supported it is, but.
There's even a UML editor.
What's that?
There's a UML editor.
Okay, so the comment is there is a UML editor, so that's huge as well. We're not going to be going into that in this presentation, but wanted to mention it so that if you think that might.
G-sharp framework.
G# framework. Okay, good. I'm glad you were here. I hadn't looked at that one. Only the good news is I think.
It's low.
Good example.
And I think the good news is do we even have any more slides? I don't know if we have. We might be stuck on demos.
No, there's a couple more to introduce demos, basically. So here, we've just got this simple VI that's just going to wait for me to try and close it. When it closes it, it's going to call the stop function on this class we have here. And here we can see that inside the, this VI down here is this guy right here. It's just doing nothing. But we are blocking inside the in-place element structure. So when we call the stop method, by trying to close it, it's just going to sit there and wait at the in-place element structure. So anytime something is keeping your in-place element structure locked, you can't do anything with it. Sometimes the abort will work, sometimes you have to go for the heavy guns and open up the task manager. And here's an example of two loops that are going to be competing with each other. Just they're both trying to modify the values in a DVR, and we can see that one of them is they're fighting with each other. So not a perfect example of a race condition. All this class is doing is calling this add method, which is just has a numeric stored in the reference, and trying to add a value to it. So we've got one that's trying to increase it, one that's trying to decrease it. You have parallel access to something, you have to worry about race conditions and making sure you're maintaining ownership of the values.
And it's just back to your previous point about going big guns and task manager. You could write a VI that asks for all VI references in memory, go to runtime top level, close itself, close the others, and keep it in your toolbox with run when open in the Windows folder.
So in case the ones in back didn't hear that, a common practice, or a practice you can do is create a VI that will close everything in LabVIEW through VI server.
Yeah.
That way, if you do have a deadlock, you don't have to kill the task manager and kill
It's
LabVIEW.
called the emergency abort VI.
Emergency abort VI.
I'll have to keep that in mind and use that.
The key to making it work is it must run when open. would be able to run it from a Windows.
Mhm.
Makes sense. And I want to iterate with these two examples. The one is the in-place element structure provides your mutexing. So as we showed that deadlock, that's by intention to be like, you probably want to think when you're using your in-place structure, do you want to access the data and let go of the resource as soon as possible, or do you want to hold on to it for a while? And if you want to hold on to it for a while, your risk in deadlock, you should think about why you're doing that. So we're demonstrating as a deadlock, but that is an intentional use, and it's up to the designer of the class to figure out how to use that.
Are you going to demo spawning a helper loop with things that take a long time?
Maybe.
I have some other code that we can look at some code where I do that.
And then I don't know, I'd say on this one, to avoid the race condition type stuff you see here, it's good to design methods that can operate and do their complete operation without, that kind of is how this is done. Guess even if you do complete, yeah, never mind. These are both complete operations, but in that case we have two loops like this designing to kind of fight with each other. In some ways I think of this as there's two Visa reads and writes in separate loops writing to the same resource. You can do that, but why do you do that?
Well, you still do this sequentially. So this is basically sending money to your bank and then taking it, sending it.
Oh, okay.
But it is a time that is into the internal transaction.
That's true. That's true.
Each
Yep.
of them
Yeah.
is valid in that.
Thanks for emphasizing.
You don't really lock up.
It's different doing this increment than to do a read, then increment it here, then write, because that would be the race condition. Good point.
Yeah, so this is just showing concurrent access, and it's not an actual race condition example other than we've got two parallel processes racing. Yeah, so we're going to talk about some of the caveats of this approach. If this would cooperate. Yep. So obviously we talked about deadlocks, race conditions. You can start doing some creative architectures with this very easily, and you can very easily get yourself into trouble. Debugging references with things being more reentrant and being easier to start background tasks, things like that. You're going to lose access to a lot of stuff that you would normally just be able to pull up from a project. I use Desktop Execution Trace Toolkit all the time as I'm developing and testing my initial implementations for things to make sure I'm getting all my references cleaned up properly. You can run that, open up your application, turn on Desktop Execution Toolkit, and then shut your program down, and it'll highlight in yellow anytime it detected a lost reference that wasn't cleaned up properly. Additionally, a Lava tool, the LabVIEW Task Manager, is really useful for getting access to shared clones. Another thing is once you start putting these reference types inside the class, and those reference types might reference other classes, you can't then have that other class refer back to the first one, because that would be a circular reference inside the reference, and LabVIEW will just not let you do that.
Unless they both inherit from the same class. Then you can have a parent.
Right, but I'm talking about for the direct class, yes, but if you can abstract to another layer and then use that base.
I understand, but you can still implement by using, by putting a reference to the parent class.
Mm-hmm.
Of the node.
Um,
And articulate to the node as a value.
You guys in back be able to.
Yes, and
If you didn't hear it in the back, there was a discussion on circular references and the idea that if you have a class and you say, I am a node, and one of the things I contain in myself is a node, that doesn't work very well. So what you can do is say, if your parent class is generic node and your node, you can say, I'm a node, and I point to a generic node. The generic node can be another node. So the takeaway is, as you're defining, if you have a self-referencing data structure, there's some tricks to make that work. Yeah.
Do you find that you have trouble serializing your classes down to a file or something if you want to save it, because LabVIEW doesn't actually know. It just knows like, oh, I need to save this class data instead of I need to dereference this and then save that data. Do you ever?
You would have to write your own method on there, where you have a known method you can call to serialize the data and do that manually.
Gotcha.
Basically, we need to take out the data and serialize it.
Yeah, so one of the things I do to make that easier sometimes is there's that reference data cluster that I have. I'll just pull that out, serialize that, and return that as a serialized data. That covers 90% of the cases that I do. Sometimes you need to do more than that.
Say OpenGDS automatically generates for you API that gives you not only DVR itself out, but the data itself. And you can stick it in here. It's a kind of universal access and would have all your data, not particular data. So you can then only do that is play with the string as your serialization.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, two other differences I think we should include in our discussion of Actor Framework. One, it is built on top of a cube message handler, so it's inherently messaging in structure. And I'm wondering if you're going to cover messaging. I realize I can put a key reference inside my class data, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of the other way around. Actor Framework is built on top of cube message handler as a backbone. If I'm going to stream or message, I need to sit down and include that structure.
Nothing prevents you from.
Did everybody hear the
nothing,
question?
nothing prevents me from that. But the other thing is, well, I appreciate great power and great responsibility. One of the design things of Actor Framework was because they did research on a lot of cube message handler applications that were being built out there that were inherently hard to debug that had lots of issues. And so we tried to create, they tried to create a standard framework that could encapsulate a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a framework which can handle a lot of those things for me? Because I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm solving, several of these problems in my mind. We're talking about closing references. How about an execute? To close all the references at the end, and all of these things. But I am returning back to a lot of burden on me to create the framework. I appreciate the power. I like my reference classes to a certain extent.
I'll be showing some demos of how I make it quicker.
The code maintenance overhead that I inherently get into for smaller applications in the framework. So I'm kind of in this limbo.
Yeah, so this isn't something that you start doing and 100% of your classes become by reference. This is an active choice for a part of an application or a part of a software component where you're designing it to inherently be operating in multiple loops or multiple parallel processes at the same time. I do have some stuff we'll be looking at on how I make that easier on myself. I'm not eliminating the extra work on that, but it's pretty close to just using a regular class as is.
And can I ask, I mean, we have a lot to cover, so I see us doing a lot of demos that are going to help you if you want to do that. How many other people are interested in that discussion of Actor Framework versus this? Because that might be a good thing to carry offline. I don't know. I'd like to have more time for questions. We'll see. We might be able to sell it. We'll try to get through to have some time for questions. But there's some cool automated stuff for.
Can make better actors with this than Actor Framework.
They wouldn't be technically active because
Right.
they don't do messaging.
They still can do them. You can still refer to the data of that actor within itself by reference. It could still have the
Yeah, but that's
process.
not messaging.
No, it could. Some of your actions can still be messaging.
All right.
Okay, so continuing with the caveats, as you're starting to launch asynchronous background tasks and starting to learn the things you need to pay attention to get everything shut down, you'll see this more than a handful of times as you're closing the project to get everything closed down, or you could use that emergency stop VI. I get this quite a bit when I don't pay attention to the lifetime of objects and some background task closes down that had initiated some other by reference types. LabVIEW conveniently unloads that definition from memory for you, and then something else still tries to use that class and you get crash. So There are some caveats to doing this. There will be headaches. This is the message from that, showing that the runtime thought it could unload that from memory, but it was actually recognized that it's still being used elsewhere, and whoever made this log message in NI, they're right. So again, this just gives you more creative access or creative ability in designing your application architectures. You get to choose how far down the rabbit hole you go. The nice thing about this is with everything being in the reference, you can change if you decide that you don't need a queue, you only need a notifier because you only need the latest value. You can change that inside all of the external interfaces that are just VI calls. So anybody using a class that you write doing this doesn't have to know that there's a notifier underneath. With something like Active Framework, you're getting the send message queue and interacting with that instead of interacting with the class directly. So it's just a little bit more of a cohesive representation of your software components. And again, it greatly reduces the number of classes you have to develop for an application.
For a different reason. Active Framework has a lot of classes because it is based on command pattern. That's what creates classes for you. Not because they interact differently with the data.
Yeah, it's
because they chose every message to be a separate class and rate the encapsulation and the coupling principle, not filing the you have to do like this with the abstract message.
Yeah, when you try to
that's ridiculous.
Try to get rid of the dependency between called actors and caller actors.
Just because you may erroneously try to convert from variant or string to something else, then it is, and just because of that, well, your receiver better know, like, which message has data of what type. Doing that, all that huge explosion of classes, just to overcome that is stupid.
So there is extra stuff you have to put down in your block diagrams when you're using references. However, one of the first things you can do is you can start adding things to your palettes. And there's an option when you're editing your palette menus to, instead of dropping a VI down, you can drop the contents of that VI down. So similar to just dropping an unbundle by name, you can have it a snippet VI where you already have the unbundle by name to pull the reference out of the class, have your in-place element structure set up with the unbundle inside of that for the data you want to pull out. So doesn't take any more time than using an unbundle by name by itself. Another thing that I've started working on, I'm still working on it, it will be available eventually. I'm trying to get it we'll discuss the functionality I'm trying to add to it. But you can start to add more functionality to LabVIEW. There are, I forget which presentation it is, I think it usually comes up in some of the hidden gems, or I think it was Steve Mercer gives a presentation pretty frequently about things you can do to add functionality to LabVIEW. It gets mentioned in there. It's not supported by LabVIEW, by National Instruments. While you're trying to get it working, you will break LabVIEW a couple of times, and you better be comfortable with VI scripting. However, you can save yourself a lot of time.
This video is a great presentation on YouTube that I gave that talks about why you should not do that, how cool it is.
Yeah. Maybe that's the one. Maybe that's the presentation I'm thinking of.
But don't do it.
You guys hear in back hear that? That was great. About framework provider. What is it? Framework provider? Project provider. It's a way of modifying LabVIEW within LabVIEW. The presentation was why you shouldn't do it and how cool it is to do it.
So here I'm going to create a class that I want to use as a by reference class. So I'm just going to create it in the project. What I'm about to do does require it being saved first, so I'm going to save it.
So a lot of this can be automated.
Yes.
Like the OpenJS and the G# framework.
This doesn't pull in any other framework dependencies, though. This is just development environment tooling.
I'm just saying that it can be automated with BI script.
Yeah.
So for those in the back, we're manually creating a class to demonstrate the principles of making a by-reference class. It was noted that this can be done in a tool, and it actually is in the GDS, possibly others. You can write your own if this is the path you take. Just like Actor Framework has the message maker, you might want to be automatically creating these by-reference classes.
So only 2 of these menu entries work properly so far. We're going to be taking a look at creating a static class that doesn't inherit from anything.
Actually, so I should point
But
out.
already, all of my virtual folders and my structure, my reference data type, everything is created for me and glued together.
So we should point out that this is the project provider that Derrick's modified. This is
Yeah, so using project providers, you can add menu items to things in the project window. But we can see I've already got my constructor here, which created my DVR and put everything in the class for me. Oh, maybe hit save. Cleanup is already created. Just so I don't start off with broken run arrows, my reference data just starts with a string. One of my first things I would do is come in here and put the actual data in there I need. And my class has the reference type on there. So you can do some tooling to help speed some of this up. Let's create a property just to pull that, get and set that ID out. So placing VI by snippet, so I've got this extra menu I put into my palette menu where I've got a couple of nodes down here. These are just representative of what they're typically going to be doing. So all I have to do is wire up my class, select the right one, and that's as many mouse clicks as using an unbundle by name with a regular class. So just a couple of little things that speed up little bits of the development using this. I've got a couple of different pattern types that I have available in here. Like if you need to wire stuff in. When I copied and pasted this into my template VI, it just had the checkbox rec. It's going to show up broken first, but for things where you need to pull something out, update it, put it back in. So I've just got a couple of the most common patterns I've come across while I'm working with references. I've used this. So this one just lets me pass my class around. So I can now put other VI calls after this, and they're not gonna attempt to get called until this finishes. So I've got a couple of different patterns that I put in here. Let's see if we can get this. I can actually demonstrate that option. So in your tools menu under advanced, you can edit your palette set. This is probably going to be the slowest demo. While that's running, I'll get ready to actually show that secondary project provider framework. Still deciding to open that menu. It might have crashed. But in that menu, when you're adding the eyes to your block diagram menu, you can then right-click on that menu entry you've created, and there'll just be a checkbox in that pop-up menu for placing contents instead of the VI itself. Okay, here we go. Which one? Okay. So by ref, I've got these guys here that I've added from the folder where they live on disk. And you just choose place VI contents, and then that's how I'm getting those structures placed down. So it can simplify some of the most common things you do that would normally take extra time. Trying to remember exactly where, no, resource. if you do start looking into trying to do some provider framework tooling, you don't get to complain to anybody about it. It's the whole don't do it. You can, it's really cool, but you won't get help. But the basic way it works is when it loads up your code from that provider framework function, it's going to query your framework to figure out which VIs are actually providing for the functionality you're doing. So here we're just doing pop-up menus for items in the project, and then when one of those items is selected, we're just giving the names of the VIs we're going to create. So we create the menu where I've just got a static list of functions that I know I'm working on providing, and the identifiers for them. There's an INI file that goes with this that also specifies what project types your framework works with. So here's the code for the static scaffolding I demonstrated. I've got this enumeration which goes through the steps for creating that, and any of the missing virtual folders or data types that it's looking for, it will create. Here's the example of creating the constructor. We're going to actually create the constructor method. We provide some external hooks for doing additional scripting, and there's quite a bit of VI scripting to get all this stuff wired together and change some of the front panel controls to constants. Instead, since it's a static class, it doesn't inherit from anything, I make it not force me to wire a class type into that VI. As I continue to work on other features where we can actually do dynamic inherent classes that provide inheritance of some sort, I'm still working on figuring out the VI scripting for that. But so there are things you can do to speed stuff up.
I was just wondering if you could show an example of one of those asynchronous processes, one of those like daemons that you spin up, and kind of show how you close it out without hitting the deadlock condition.
Sure. As soon as I remember where I had one of those. So what you're about to see is the opposite of Stephen Watt's Lean LabVIEW presentation. These are heavy, thick software components I'm using that I've created. So we've got this application, which is, I made this to test some of the software components I'm writing. So you can see these two UIs are glued together.
Can you show that me?
Mm-hmm.
How you launch that?
We'll get into it. But this is bidirectional, going both directions. They update each other. I'm going to have to shut these down so we can look at their block diagrams. This is what's in this entire application. Everything else is in the reusable libraries. So this is all of the front panel controls, are all of these guys right here. There's nothing going on here. Everything is getting glued together because there's some configuration files that define what my... So this is a framework I've developed for doing distributed control systems. I've got an INI file here that defines the tags and some of their properties. And then this VI can register itself with a UI adapter that then crawls all the references for that VI, and then it maps it to the VI that they came from. It maps it to any values that that they correspond to. But then I've got a bunch of stuff running in the background that handles that. Let's see here. So in that UI adapter, in its constructor, it's doing some stuff, initializing some things, creating events that it uses to communicate internally. And then it's launching a background loop. So this is a loop that registers events for all of those controls. So this background loop is handling all the value change events for anything on the front panel. That's why I didn't need to do any of that in the front panel. And then just the other internal events for the component. So it can get the value change events. One of the events that we register is a stop event. So elsewhere in my code, when I need to start shutting down my UI manager, one of the first things it does is signal to fire that event that tells it to shut down. So this background loop doesn't ever keep a DVR locked. So it's not ever blocking somebody else from getting that event out of the DVR and firing an event for that. So we can respond to this event. We close down these two notifiers, which get these loops to shut down, and everything shuts down and cleans up. Yeah, keep asking questions. If any questions you guys have, or any specific thing you saw in here.
This is a great. We'll have 9 minutes. We could have material to show more.
How do you launch?
But if you guys have specific
Oh,
questions.
right, yeah. He wanted to see the.
Very first class. How do you launch?
So what this looks like is there is this client class that this then inherits from. So this has that start function. And it's got some entry point hooks for where the custom application can do its initialization.
That start is not necessarily construction, right?
It is. This is a little bit.
Well, if we could open up another. Obviously, the needs for this project were much different than the needs of the PID example earlier. In the PID example earlier, how we would start the asynchronous is when you construct. The same time you create your DVR, that's when you do an open VI reference. You're just opening a VI, and you're doing a call, start asynchronous call. That way it'll start the other loop running at the same time. That other loop gets the same DVR, and using the DVR, they talk back and forth. The interesting thing, too, is because that other loop has the DVR, it can actually use it to know when to close down. It can say, I'll run until the DVR is disclosed.
So
that's a good example of starting. I think I saw a hand in back.
Yeah, if your DVR is a child class and you have your property node, can you get accessors of the parent from that property node?
Yeah, so what would happen is because each class in that hierarchy, in the parent-child hierarchy, has its own private data, you'll end up, if you do a descendancy of file reference objects, each one will have its own DVR. The nice thing is if you create accessors, when you right-click on, when you select accessors, you'll see the accessors for the parent, the accessors for the child, accessors for the I mean, the other nice thing is if the child needs access to the parent data, you can make the accessors protected, which means if I'm not the child, I can't see him, but the child can see him and access him. So it's kind of, yeah, great question. Any other questions?
Do you have any tooling for probing the class data or viewing the current state of class data at any point in time?
No.
Such a great question. We don't. In fact, a coworker in the room taught me something. It's interesting. He'll drop a loop that has the by reference wire, some slow pull rate, and then look, at all the properties and just wire them into tunnels on the wall loop. That way, anytime it's running, you can probe them and see them. I thought that was kind of an interesting way. But I should express, correct me if you guys take a different opinion. One of the great things, I'm not a big fan of Actor Framework, but one of the great things it's done is rallied a bunch of people to define, like Jason was saying earlier, a standard and way of doing things. I guess I see by reference as being a little bit more in infancy, but having greater potential because you could start talking. I mean, although Actor Framework does provide a lot, you still have to say, well, what's your loops? What's your messages? I see it being almost easier to define projects in terms of what are my objects that I'm talking about? What are their properties and methods? And how might they talk to each other? Defining these, making them out. But it is still, point being, it's in its infancies. Love feedback. I'd love to see us as a community talk and get more of a standard way of saying, and I'll get on a soapbox for a minute if I haven't already been on one. Who has used and read from a DAC-MX task? Right? Okay. Who's done it using events? I'm surprised by how many hands. Do you use the events more, or do you use the read property more, and why? And just that thought for me is a thought exercise of saying, it's so many times it's just so much more convenient to drop a method on something and use it. We think in terms, I think more of methods. Anyway, get off my soapbox. I see a big potential. We still have 5 minutes, which is great. We have more stuff. If you think of anything, interrupt me.
I've got a pared down
But
example.
if there's other questions, let's keep. I love the questions. If that's all right.
Can I just respond real quick to this one? I believe you can add a custom probe for a class, pull out the DVR, and it's like any other probe. You can make custom probes for your class.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
I wasn't aware they could be functions.
Yeah.
I haven't used that yet, obviously.
We have an example waiting to show. Is there any questions before we?
So this is just a pared down example of, so this isn't running asynchronously in the background, but it is running as a parallel task. So we just have this same stop VI where we're doing the same thing. In the initialization, we're creating the event. We're also simultaneously registering for it. So later here in our loop VI, we just have to pull that out of the class and we use that. This class is doing nothing but being told to shut down. Again, this event loop isn't inside the in-place element structure, so we're not preventing anybody else from updating stuff or getting stuff out of that DVR.
So to say, why do you feel that the two are exclusive? Like, so I do a lot of actors where I will have a DVR for my status data, and then I can provide that DVR as just like you know, you can pass. Like I have a callback where I say to anybody that launches me, here's my DVR, by the way, and you can read my status by having the DVR. So you can have an actor.
Excellent question. I want to make sure that people in the back heard that. The question was, are they mutually exclusive? Actors with messaging and references? And the answer is no. No, you can mix and match. I don't know if anybody else has a comment. I think it might be a style issue.
It kind of violates the idea of actor framework if you're...
No, it doesn't. The actor wants to access its own data at risk.
Okay, as long as you're not passing that out of that one actor.
Right to access any of its data within its own data.
No, but it's not like he was giving that DVR to other people.
Oh, to us.
So he was exposing the interstate to outside the actor.
Yeah, that's a no-no.
Yeah, that's an excellent style question. I'm not sure I have a good style answer. I would take that methods are great for asynchronous. I'm sending messages and moving on. References are great for synchronous. I want to do something and not continue on until it's done.
And it depends on what the data is you're trying to manage, right? Like if you have a very large data set, and the last thing you want to do then is take that, make a bunch of copies and send it to a whole bunch of actors to duplicate it until you have a crash because of lack of memory, right? So in those applications, you use Active Framework and you use the messaging of Active Framework to handle like the command and control within your application. Like, everybody start up now. All right, we've got some new data that's coming in. Here's the header for that data. Of course, you all know where it's at. It's in that DVR, but now you know how to interpret that data, right? And you use the command and control aspect of Active Framework for that. But your big data set, you don't pass around to Active Framework. Your big data set, you're going to use the DVR. Or if you have something that's really high rate, you might use a queue, for instance, or something like that. You still use all of those ways of passing your data sets when they make sense. But you're still using Active Framework because the advantages of spawning off the asynchronous process that you can talk to and you can see messages from and all that. And then if you go beyond that and you get into panel actors, for instance, now you have the most powerful UI creation tool that we have. And instead of going, all right, well now how do I make this really complicated UI? It's like, well, that tool set's provided. All you gotta do is inherit from it, and you can make this really complicated UI where you can change out UI elements on your own.
But that's the difference. Your data, big data, to which you want to provide reference to multiple actors, is kind of external to those actors. It's not the actor data that is passed directly to
I see some people leaving. We'll close down. We have business cards. We'll love this discussion. If you don't need to get off to the next presentation. Very good. Derrick,
I don't have business cards. You can have his.
I have business cards, but yeah, come.
Oh yeah, Indigit.com. If you want to get these addresses, this is where I will be posting any of the frameworks or stuff that I make available for my presentations. Eventually, I'll be making videos that I'll be posting to YouTube that kind of rehashes this. And anybody